This is HOA rejected. It started as a rumor and ended as a case file. You are not allowed to ignore the process. Evelyn Morgan pointed at an empty folder on the management office counter and yelled that missing records meant the issue never happened. I stood there holding a printed minutes packet with the page folded to hide a line item, and I watched her face twist with that specific brand of fury you only see when someone knows they are about to be caught. The folder was supposed to contain the enforcement history for a 2019 towing incident that had never made sense, and now it was targeting me again 3 years later with the exact same wording. She slammed the folder shut and told me the discussion was over. I am a property appraiser in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and I know what liens do to value. I moved into Lakeshore Landing Terrace Association 2 years ago because the comps looked stable and the rules seemed standard. What I did not know was that the neighborhood portal was full of screenshots and accusations, and that Evelyn Morgan, the neighborhood watch liaison who treats residents like suspects, had been running selective enforcement like a personal vendetta machine since at least 2019. The cold case I reopened was simple. Someone had been towed for an expired registration sticker in May 2019. The board minutes mentioned a vote on the enforcement policy, but the vote was never recorded, and the policy PDF had a creation date 3 months after the towing. I only cared because the same violation notice showed up on my windshield 2 weeks ago, and I am trying to keep my home insurance stable while the HOA is pushing me toward a claim. Evelyn folded her arms across the reflective safety vest she throws on to look official and said, "I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized. Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." I did not respond. I just took a photo of the empty folder with my phone, and she lunged forward to block the shot. The management office clerk, a tired woman in her 50s named Sharon, stepped between us and asked Evelyn to please calm down. Evelyn ignored her and told me I had 72 hours to submit a records request in the proper format, or the violation would escalate to a fine. I already had the timeline in my head. The mail carrier confirms a delivery window, and I have to photograph the envelope before it is lost. I nodded once and walked out. The towing incident from 2019 had always bothered people in the neighborhood. A resident named Marcus Tully came home from a work trip and found his truck gone, towed from his own driveway, because the registration sticker was 2 weeks expired. The fine was $400 plus the tow and impound fees, and the board minutes from that month mentioned a discussion about enforcement consistency but never showed a vote. Marcus paid the fine, sold the house 6 months later, and the whole thing disappeared. Except the policy PDF that Sharon sent me last week when I requested the governing documents had a file creation date of August 14th, 2019, and Marcus was towed on May 22nd, 2019. Someone had written the policy after the fact and backdated the enforcement. I pulled into my driveway and saw 2 neighbors whispering while pointing at the tow truck idling 3 houses down. I got out and walked over. The driver was a guy in his 30s with a clipboard, and he was hooking up a sedan with an expired registration sticker. I asked him who called it in. He said the HOA compliance officer, and he showed me the dispatch log with Evelyn's name and a timestamp from 20 minutes ago. I took a photo of the log. The driver shrugged and said he just follows the calls. I asked if he remembered doing a similar tow in 2019. He checked his records on a tablet and said, yeah, same address, same violation, same caller. I asked if he could send me a copy of that dispatch log. He said he would have to check with his supervisor. I went back inside and opened my laptop. The HOA portal had a records section that was supposed to be accessible to all homeowners, but half the links were dead and the other half required admin approval. I submitted a formal records request for all enforcement actions from 2019 to present, all board meeting minutes, and all policy adoption votes. The system auto-replied that my request had been received and would be processed within 10 business days. I set a calendar alert and started building a spreadsheet. I listed every enforcement action I could find mentioned in the portal, every complaint thread, every notice photo someone had posted. A pattern emerged immediately. Evelyn had called in 6 towing violations in 3 years, and every single one had been for registration stickers. No other violation type, no other board member had ever called in a towing. The policy PDF had been updated 3 times since 2019, and every update had a creation date that was suspiciously close to an enforcement action. That night I got an email from Sharon at the management office. She said my records request had been reviewed and denied because I had not specified the format and delivery method in accordance with the updated request policy. She attached a PDF of the policy, which had a creation date of yesterday. I replied and asked when the policy had been adopted by the board. She did not respond. I forwarded the email to a contractor I know named Luis Vargas, who had done work in the neighborhood in 2019 and had photos and timestamps from the day Karen interfered with a site inspection. Luis replied within an hour and said he remembered Evelyn showing up with a laminated rules sheet and threatening to call code enforcement if he did not move his truck. He still had the photos on his phone, and the timestamps showed Evelyn had been on site 3 hours before the board meeting where she claimed the truck rule had been discussed. I called the management company mainline the next morning and asked to speak to a supervisor. I was transferred to a man named Greg, who sounded exhausted before I even started talking. I explained the timeline, the missing vote, the backdated policy PDF, and the records request denial. Greg said he would look into it and call me back. He did not call back. I left 2 more messages over the next 3 days and got nothing. On the 4th day, I drove to the management company office and walked into the lobby with my printed packet of evidence. Greg was standing near the front desk talking to another property manager, and when he saw me, he immediately tried to redirect me to Sharon. I said I needed to speak to him in person about a compliance issue, and I held up the packet. Greg reluctantly walked me into a small conference room. I laid out the timeline on the table. Marcus Tully towed in May 2019. Policy PDF created in August 2019. My violation notice in January 2025 using identical wording, and the records request denial using a policy that did not exist until I asked for records. Greg rubbed his face and said he could not comment on individual enforcement decisions. I said this was not about individual decisions. This was about forged documentation and selective enforcement. He said he would need to review the board minutes before making any statements. I said the board minutes were incomplete and I could prove it. I pulled out the folded printed agenda packet, unfolded it, and showed him the line item about the enforcement vote that had been folded to hide it during the May 2019 meeting. Greg stared at the packet and said he had never seen that version. I asked Greg where he got his copy of the May 2019 minutes. He said they came from the board secretary, which at the time was Evelyn Morgan. I said that explained everything. Greg said he could not accuse a board member without proof. I said I had proof, and I pulled out Luis Vargas's photos showing Evelyn on site with the laminated rules sheet 3 hours before the meeting. Greg looked at the timestamps and said that did not prove she forged the minutes. I said it proved she was enforcing a rule that had not been voted on yet, which meant either she made it up or she knew the vote was going to pass before the meeting happened. Greg said he would need to consult with the HOA attorney. I said fine, but I was not paying any fines or moving my car until this was resolved. Greg said the HOA had the authority to tow regardless of my objections. I said they could try, and I would file a theft report with the sheriff. I left the management office and drove to the sheriff's substation on the north end of town. I asked to speak to a deputy about a potential fraud issue related to HOA enforcement. The deputy who came out was a young guy named Ramirez, who looked like he had heard this story 100 times. I gave him the short version and showed him the timeline. He said HOA disputes were usually civil matters and the sheriff could not get involved unless there was evidence of a crime. I said forging meeting minutes and backdating enforcement policies sounded like fraud to me. He said I would need to file a formal complaint and provide documentation. I said I had documentation, and I handed him a copy of the evidence packet. He said he would pass it along to the detective unit, but it could take weeks. I asked if he could at least make a note in the system that I had reported the issue, in case Evelyn tried to escalate. He said he could do that, and he took down my information. I went home and found a notice taped to my front door. It was a formal violation letter from the HOA, dated that morning, stating that I had failed to comply with the registration sticker policy, and that my vehicle would be towed within 24 hours if I did not submit proof of compliance. The letter was signed by Evelyn Morgan, Neighborhood Watch Liaison. I took a photo of the letter and texted it to Luis. He replied immediately and said I should check the portal. I logged in and saw that Evelyn had posted a public complaint thread about my vehicle, complete with photos of my windshield and a long paragraph about residents who think they are above the rules. The thread had 6 replies, all from other homeowners saying they had been targeted by similar enforcement and asking how I was fighting it. I replied to the thread with a link to the evidence spreadsheet and the timeline document. Within an hour, Evelyn had deleted the entire thread and locked my portal access. That night, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. It was Marcus Tully, the homeowner who had been towed in 2019. He said another resident had forwarded him the evidence spreadsheet, and he wanted to know if I was serious about reopening the case. I said I was. He said he still had the original violation notice and the tow receipt, and he had photos of his truck with the registration sticker that showed it was only 2 weeks expired, not 2 months like the notice had claimed. He said Evelyn had told him at the time that the policy had been in place for 6 months, but he could never find the meeting minutes that proved it. I said I had the creation date metadata on the policy PDF, and it proved the policy did not exist until 3 months after he was towed. Marcus said he wanted to file a complaint with the management company and demand a refund. I said I would help him, but we needed to wait until I had all the records so we could prove the full scope of the fraud. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Greg at the management company. He said the HOA attorney had reviewed my complaint and determined that there was insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The attorney recommended that I submit a formal appeal to the board if I wanted to contest the violation. The appeal deadline was 10 days from the date of the original notice, and I had already used 4 days. I forwarded the email to Luis and Marcus and said we needed to move faster. Luis said he could testify at a board meeting if I could get on the agenda. Marcus said he would come with me and bring his original documentation. I submitted an appeal request through the portal and got an auto reply that said my access had been suspended pending review of a code of conduct violation. I called Sharon and asked what that meant. She said Evelyn had filed a complaint alleging that I had posted defamatory statements about her in the portal thread. I said Evelyn had deleted the thread, so how could anyone review the statements? Sharon said the complaint was based on screenshots Evelyn had taken before deleting the thread. I said that was convenient. Sharon did not respond. I decided to go directly to the HOA president, a retired engineer named Harold Sims, who had been on the board for 8 years. I looked up his address in the member directory and drove over. Harold answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans and looked surprised to see me. I introduced myself and asked if I could talk to him about an enforcement issue. He said he did not usually handle individual complaints, but he invited me in. I sat at his kitchen table and laid out the entire timeline, including the backdated policy PDF, the missing vote, the records request denial, and the attempt to ban me from amenities as punishment for questioning Evelyn. Harold listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said he had suspected something like this was happening, but had never had proof. He said Evelyn had been pushing for stricter enforcement since 2018, and she had a habit of interpreting the rules in ways that no one else agreed with. He said the board had tried to rein her in, but she always found a way to escalate. I asked Harold if he could get me on the agenda for the next board meeting. He said the next meeting was in 2 weeks, and the agenda was already full. I said this could not wait 2 weeks, because Evelyn was threatening to tow my car and ban me from the amenities. Harold said he could call an emergency meeting if I could get 2 other homeowners to sign a petition. I said I already had Marcus Tully and Luis Vargas willing to testify. Harold said that was enough, and he would send out the meeting notice that afternoon. He said I should be prepared for Evelyn to fight back hard, because she did not like being challenged in public. I said I was ready. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the clubhouse. I spent the weekend preparing a presentation with printed copies of the evidence for every board member. I included the backdated policy PDF metadata, the dispatch logs from the tow company, the photos from Luis showing Evelyn enforcing a non-existent rule, the original violation notice from Marcus with the inflated expiration date, and the timeline showing the pattern of selective enforcement. I also included a summary of the records request denial and the attempt to ban me from the portal. I printed 20 copies and put them in a binder with tabs. I waited for the right audience, because the reveal needed witnesses. Tuesday night, I arrived at the clubhouse 30 minutes early. Harold was already there setting up chairs, and he said about 15 homeowners had RSVP'd, in addition to the board members. I asked if Evelyn knew about the meeting. Harold said she had called him 3 times demanding that he cancel it, and when he refused, she said she would bring her own evidence to refute my claims. I said I was looking forward to that. At 7 o'clock, the room was full. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes late wearing her reflective safety vest and carrying a stack of laminated policy sheets. She sat in the front row and glared at me. Harold called the meeting to order and asked me to present my case. I stood up and distributed the evidence binders to the board members. I walked through the timeline step by step, starting with Marcus Tully's towing in 2019 and ending with the attempt to ban me from the portal for questioning the enforcement. I showed the metadata on the policy PDF and explained that it proved the policy had been created after the enforcement action, not before. I showed the dispatch logs and explained that Evelyn was the only person who had ever called in a registration sticker towing. I showed the photos from Luis and explained that they proved Evelyn had been enforcing rules that did not exist yet. I finished by saying this was not about one violation or one homeowner. This was about a pattern of selective enforcement and forged documentation that had been going on for years. Evelyn stood up before I could sit down. She said I was lying, and that every enforcement action she had taken was in accordance with the governing documents. She said the policy PDF metadata was irrelevant because the rule had always been in the governing documents, and the PDF was just a summary for convenience. She said the dispatch logs proved nothing because anyone could call in a violation, and it was her job as neighborhood watch liaison to report violations. She said the photos from Luis were taken out of context, and she had never enforced a rule that did not exist. She said I was trying to discredit her because I did not want to follow the rules, and she demanded that the board uphold the violation and proceed with the towing. I stood up again and said I had one more piece of evidence. I pulled out a printed calendar invite for a hearing that was never sent to residents, only insiders. The invite was dated April 2019, 1 month before Marcus Tully was towed, and it showed a private discussion between Evelyn and the tow company about increasing enforcement. I said I had obtained the invite from the tow company supervisor after I requested their full communication history with the HOA. I asked Evelyn to explain why she was coordinating enforcement actions with the tow company before the policy had been voted on. Evelyn did not respond. She just stared at the printed invite and then sat down. Harold asked Evelyn if she wanted to respond. She said she needed to consult with the HOA attorney before making any statements. Harold said the board could not wait for an attorney consultation, and he asked the other board members to vote on whether to suspend the enforcement action against me pending a full investigation. The vote was 4-1 in favor of suspension. Evelyn was the only dissenting vote. Harold then asked the board to vote on whether to retain an independent auditor to review all enforcement actions from 2019 to present. The vote was unanimous in favor. Evelyn stood up and said she was resigning from the board effective immediately. She said she was tired of being attacked by residents who did not appreciate her work, and she walked out. The room was silent for about 10 seconds, and then one of the homeowners in the back started clapping. 2 others joined in, and then the whole room was applauding. I sat down and tried not to look too satisfied. Harold adjourned the meeting and said the board would issue a formal statement within 48 hours. I stayed behind to help him clean up the chairs, and he said he had suspected Evelyn was manipulating the enforcement process, but had never been able to prove it. He said my evidence packet was the most thorough thing he had ever seen, and he was glad I had taken the time to document everything. The next morning I got an email from Greg at the management company. He said the HOA attorney had reviewed the evidence I presented at the meeting, and recommended that the HOA retract the enforcement action in writing and issue a formal apology. He attached a draft letter and asked me to confirm my mailing address. I forwarded the email to Marcus and Luis and said we had won the first round. Marcus replied and said he was going to file a claim for reimbursement of the 2019 towing fees. Luis replied and said he was going to submit a formal complaint to the state contractors board about Evelyn's interference with his work. I said I would support both actions. 2 days later, the HOA board issued a public statement. It said the board had retained an independent auditor to review all enforcement actions from 2019 to present, and that any homeowner who believed they had been subject to improper enforcement could submit a reimbursement claim. It said Evelyn Morgan had resigned from her position as Neighborhood Watch Liaison, and that the board was implementing new oversight procedures to prevent similar issues in the future. It said the board deeply regretted the harm caused by the improper enforcement actions and was committed to rebuilding trust with the community. The statement was posted on the HOA portal and emailed to every homeowner. I logged into the portal and saw that my access had been restored. The complaint thread that Evelyn had deleted was still gone, but someone had started a new thread asking for details about the reimbursement process. I replied with a summary of the evidence and the timeline, and within an hour the thread had 30 replies from homeowners who had been targeted by similar enforcement. 3 homeowners said they had been towed for registration stickers, 2 said they had been fined for parking violations that were not in the rules, and 1 said Evelyn had threatened to call code enforcement over a decorative planter. I added all of them to a group email and offered to help them file reimbursement claims. The following week, the independent auditor released a preliminary report. It said the auditor had reviewed 112 enforcement actions from 2019 to present, and that 43 of those actions appeared to have been based on policies that were not in effect at the time of enforcement. It said the auditor had identified at least 6 cases where meeting minutes had been altered or incomplete, and that the alterations appeared to favor stricter enforcement. It said the auditor recommended that the HOA board adopt a formal records retention policy, implement a third-party review process for all enforcement actions, and consider seeking restitution from the individuals responsible for the improper actions. The report did not name Evelyn directly, but everyone knew who it was talking about. I submitted a formal complaint to the management company asking them to discipline Greg for failing to investigate the enforcement issues when I first brought them to his attention. The complaint included a timeline showing that I had contacted Greg 4 times before going to the board, and that he had ignored every request. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the management company regional director, a woman named Patricia, who said she had reviewed my complaint and agreed that Greg had not handled the situation appropriately. She said Greg had been reassigned to a different property, and that the management company was implementing new training procedures to ensure similar issues did not happen in the future. She said the management company was also issuing a written apology for the mishandling of my case, and that they would be refunding my HOA dues for the current year as compensation. I accepted the apology and the refund. Marcus Tully filed a reimbursement claim for the 2019 towing fees, and the HOA board approved it within 2 weeks. Marcus said he was going to use the money to take his family on a vacation, and that he was glad he had kept all the original documentation. Luis Vargas submitted a formal complaint to the state contractors board about Evelyn's interference, and the board opened an investigation. Luis said the investigation was ongoing, but he was confident it would result in at least a warning letter. I said I hoped it would result in more than that. The biggest surprise came 3 weeks after the emergency meeting. I got a call from a lawyer representing a group of homeowners who were considering a class action lawsuit against the HOA for the improper enforcement actions. The lawyer said he had reviewed the independent auditor report and believed there was a strong case for damages based on the forged meeting minutes and the backdated policies. He asked if I would be willing to serve as a lead plaintiff. I said I would think about it, but I was more interested in making sure the HOA fixed the underlying problems than in pursuing a lawsuit. The lawyer said he understood, and that he would keep me updated on the progress of the case. 2 months after the emergency meeting, the HOA board held a special election to fill the vacant board seats. 3 new members were elected, all of them homeowners who had been targeted by Evelyn's enforcement actions. The new board immediately voted to adopt a formal records retention policy, implement a third-party review process for all enforcement actions, and ban any board member from serving as the sole enforcement contact. The new board also voted to send a written order to the management company requiring that all communication from board members be routed through official channels, and that no board member be allowed to contact vendors directly without board approval. The vote was unanimous. I ran into Evelyn one more time, about 3 months after she resigned. I was at the grocery store, and she was in the checkout line ahead of me. She did not say anything, but she looked at me and then looked away. I did not say anything either. I just waited for her to finish and then paid for my groceries. As I was walking out, I saw her sitting in her car in the parking lot, staring at her phone. I thought about stopping and saying something, but I decided there was nothing left to say. She had lost, and she knew it. The final piece of the puzzle came 4 months after the emergency meeting. The independent auditor released a final report that included a recommendation that the HOA seek restitution from Evelyn Morgan for the costs associated with the improper enforcement actions. The report estimated the total cost at approximately $12,000, including reimbursement claims, legal fees, and auditor fees. The HOA board voted to pursue the restitution, and they sent a demand letter to Evelyn through their attorney. Evelyn did not respond to the letter, and the HOA board voted to file a civil claim in small claims court. The case was scheduled for a hearing 6 months later. I did not attend the hearing, but Harold Sims sent me a text afterward saying the judge had ruled in favor of the HOA and ordered Evelyn to pay the full amount. Harold said Evelyn had shown up without a lawyer and tried to argue that she had been following the rules, but the judge had cut her off and said the evidence was overwhelming. The HOA also voted to strip Evelyn of her access to the portal admin tools, which meant she could no longer delete threads, lock accounts, or post official notices. The new board president, one of the homeowners who had been elected in the special election, sent an email to all residents explaining that the portal would now be managed by the management company with oversight from the board, and that no individual board member would have unilateral access. The email also said that the board was committed to transparency and accountability, and that residents were encouraged to report any concerns about enforcement actions directly to the board. The email ended with a reminder that the HOA governing documents were available on the portal, and that all enforcement actions would be documented and published in the monthly board minutes. I kept the evidence binder on my desk for another 6 months, just in case Evelyn tried to retaliate or challenge the findings. She never did. The restitution claim was paid in full. The class action lawsuit was settled out of court with a small payment to each affected homeowner, and the new board implemented every recommendation from the independent auditor. The neighborhood portal became less toxic, the enforcement actions became more consistent, and the HOA stopped feeling like a weapon. I still check the portal once a week to make sure nothing weird is happening, but for the most part it is just boring meeting minutes and maintenance updates. The funny thing about the whole situation is that Evelyn insisted on a deadline, and the timestamp proves she lied. She had told me I had 72 hours to submit a records request in the proper format, but the denial email came back within 24 hours, citing a policy that had been created the day before my request. When I pointed that out to the independent auditor, he said it was one of the clearest examples of procedural abuse he had ever seen. He said Evelyn had essentially invented a rule to block my request, and then used the blocked request as justification for escalating the enforcement. He said it was a classic case of moving the goalposts, and it had probably worked dozens of times before because no one had ever called her on it. I said I was just glad I had documented everything. The final irony came about a year after the emergency meeting. The HOA board voted to update the governing documents to include a formal cold case review process, which would allow any homeowner to request a review of past enforcement actions if they believed they had been improperly targeted. The process required the board to retain an independent auditor, review all relevant documentation, and issue a public report within 90 days. The vote was unanimous, and the new policy was added to the portal within a week. Harold Sims sent me a personal email saying the policy was inspired by my case, and that he hoped it would prevent similar abuses in the future. I replied and said I was glad something good had come out of the whole mess. If you want to see more stories where HOA tyrants finally face consequences, hit that like button and subscribe. I look back at the whole cold case now, and I realize the key was never letting Evelyn control the narrative. Every time she tried to move the goalposts, I documented it. Every time she tried to intimidate me, I stayed calm and gathered more proof. Every time she tried to delete the evidence, I had already made copies. The system only works when people are willing to do the boring, tedious work of building a paper trail and refusing to back down. It is not dramatic, it is not fun, and it takes months. But it works. The neighborhood is quieter now. The two neighbors who used to whisper while pointing at the tow truck do not have to whisper anymore. The mail carrier does not have to worry about delivery windows being used as evidence against residents. The contractor who had photos and timestamps from the day Karen interfered does not have to fight to access the site anymore. The The management company supervisor who refused to engage in the parking lot scene does not have to deal with board members ambushing her at work. The deputy who stepped between us at the showdown does not have to write as many reports about HOA harassment. The system is not perfect, but it is better, and that is all I wanted. Evelyn Morgan is still living in the neighborhood, as far as I know. She does not come to board meetings anymore, she does not post in the portal, and she does not wear the reflective safety vest in public. I see her occasionally at the mailbox cluster or driving past my house, and we do not acknowledge each other. I do not need her to apologize or admit she was wrong. I just need her to leave people alone, and so far she has. The written order from management that Karen must route all communication through official channels has held, and the new board has enforced it strictly. Karen gets stripped of access to the portal admin tools was not a suggestion, it was a permanent revocation, and the management company confirmed it in writing. The HOA retracts the enforcement action in writing, and issues a formal apology is not something I ever expected to see, but it happened, and it is framed on my office wall as a reminder that persistence pays off. The entire cold case investigation took almost 9 months from start to finish, but it was worth it. I kept my home insurance stable, I avoided a bogus fine and towing, I helped a dozen other homeowners get reimbursed, and I forced the HOA to fix a broken enforcement system that had been weaponized for years. The printed minutes packet with the folded page is still in the evidence binder on my desk. I use it as a teaching tool whenever someone asks me how I beat the HOA. I show them the fold line and explain how Evelyn had hidden the line item about the enforcement vote, and how unfolding it proved the vote had never actually happened. I show them the metadata on the policy PDF and explain how creation dates do not lie. I show them the dispatch logs and explain how patterns of enforcement reveal intent. I show them the calendar invite and explain how coordination with vendors before a policy vote proves premeditation. And I show them the audit report and explain how independent verification is the only way to force accountability. The case is closed now, but the lessons are not. Every homeowner in an HOA needs to understand that the system is only as fair as the people who run it, and that bad actors will exploit every loophole and every procedural gap until someone forces them to stop. The way you force them to stop is not by yelling or threatening or vandalizing. It is by documenting everything, building an airtight case, and presenting it to an audience that cannot ignore it. It is boring, it is tedious, and it takes months, but it works every single time as long as you do not give up. Thanks for watching, and I will be back soon.